In early 1997, CBS's TV Dragan Mihailovich arrived in Tokyo to search for Watanabe. Armed with an address and a phone number, CBS's Japanese bureau chief called the number and reached Watanabe's wife, who said that her husband couldn't speak to them. He was gravely ill and bedridden. Mihailovich had the bureau chief call again to convey his wishes for Watanabe's recovery. His wishes did the trick. Mrs. Watanabe said that her husband had left the country on business and she didn't know when he'd return. Seeing that he was being dodged, Mihailovich stalked out Watanabe's apartment building and office. He waited for hours. Watanabe didn't appear. Just as Mihailovich was losing hope, his cell phone rang. Watanabe had returned the bureau chief's call. He told the producers he had a message from Louis Zamperino. Watanabe had agreed to meet them at a Tokyo hotel. So it wasn't until the producers were like, "Hey, we have a message from Louis Zamperini." Oh, did I say Zamperino? I meant to say Zamperini, the main character of this book. Then he was like, "Okay, I'll meet with him." Mihailovich rented a room at the hotel and set up a camera crew inside. Doubting that Watanabe would agree to a sit-down interview, he rigged his cameraman with a tiny camera inside a baseball cap. At the appointed hour, in walked the bird. They sat down in the lobby and Watanabe ordered a beer. Mihailovich explained that they were profiling Louis Zamperini. Watanabe knew the name immediately. 600 prisoner, he said. Zamperini, number 1. Bob Simon, CBS's on-air correspondent for the story, thought that this would probably be his only chance to question Watanabe, so there, in the lobby, he began grilling about his treatment of Louis. Watanabe was startled. He said something about Zamperini being a good man and how Watanabe hated war. He said that his central concern had been protecting the POWs because if they had escaped, civilians would have killed them. Asked why he'd been on the list of the most wanted war criminals, he puffed with apparent pride. "I'm number 7, he said. Told you number 1. Exile, he said, had been very painful for him. They asked Watanabe if he'd come upstairs for an on-camera interview. Watanabe asked if the interview would air in Japan, and Mihailovich said no. To Mihailovich's surprise, Watanabe agreed. Upstairs, with cameras rolling, they handed Watanabe a photograph of youthful Louis standing on a track, smiling. Simon dug in. Zamperini and the other prisoners remember you, in particular, being the most brutal of all the guards. How do you explain that? Watanabe's right eyelid began drooping. Mihailovich felt uneasy. I wasn't even given orders, Watanabe said, contradicting the assertion he made in the 1995 interview. Because of my personal feelings, I treated the prisoners strictly as enemies of Japan. Zamperini was well known to me. If he says he was beaten by Watanabe, then such a thing probably occurred at the camp. If you consider my personal feelings at the time. He tossed his head high, jotted out his chin, and directed a hard gaze at Simon. He said that POWs had complained of trifle things, and had used epitaphs to refer to the Japanese. These things, he said, had made him angry. With hundreds of prisoners, he said, he'd been under great pressure. Beating and kicking in Caucasian society are considered cruel behavior, he said, speaking very slowly. However, there were some occasions in the prison camp in which beating and kicking were unavoidable. When the interview was over, Watanabe looked shaken and angry. Told that Zamperini was coming to Japan and wanted to meet him to offer his forgiveness, Watanabe replied that he would see him and apologize, on the understanding that it was only a personal apology, not one offered on behalf of the Japanese military. As they packed up, Mihailovich had a last request. Would he agree to be filmed walking down the street? This, it seemed, was what Watanabe had come for. He donned his cap, stepped in the sidewalk, turned and walked toward the camera. He moved just as he had in parades before his captives, head high, chest out, eyes imperious. One day, 9 months later, as he prepared to return to Japan to carry the Olympic torch, Louis sat at his desk for hours thinking. Then he clicked on his computer and began to write. To Matsuhiro Watanabe, as a result of my prisoner of war experience under your unwarranted and unreasonable punishment, my post-war life became a nightmare. It was not so much due to the pain and suffering as it was the tension of stress and humiliation that caused me to hate with a vengeance. Under your discipline, my rights, not only as a prisoner of war, but also as a human being, were stripped from me. It was a struggle to maintain enough dignity and hope to live until the war's end. The post-war nightmares caused my life to crumble, but thanks to a confrontation with God through the evangelist Billy Graham, I committed my life to Christ. Love replaced the hate I had for you, Christ said, and Christ said, forgive your enemies and pray for them. As you probably know, I returned to Japan in 1952 and was graciously allowed to address all the Japanese war criminals at Sugamo prison. I asked them about you and was told that you probably had committed harakiri, suicide, which I was sad to hear. At that moment, like the others, I also forgave you and now would hope that you would also become a Christian. He folded the letter and carried it with him to Japan. The meeting was not to be. CBS contacted Watanabe and told him that Zamperini wanted to come see him. Watanabe practically spat his reply. The answer was no. When Louis arrived in Joitsu, he still had the letter. Someone took it from him, promising to get it to Watanabe. If Watanabe received it, he never replied. Watanabe died in April 2003. So Watanabe, like Louis, lived in an old age and was never punished for his crimes. And he had a chance to meet with Louis, and he's like, no. In front of the cameras, he's like, I will meet with him. Then when it came time to it, he's like, no. On the morning of January 20, that's how he said it too. He's like, no. On the morning of January 22nd, 1998, snow sifted gently over the village once known as Nautsu. Louis Zamperini, 4 days short of his 81st birthday, stood in a swirl of white beside a road flanked in bright drifts. His body was worn and weathered, his skin scratched with lines mapping the miles of his life. His old riot of black hair was now a translucent scrim of white, but his blue eyes still threw sparks. On the ring finger of his right hand, a scar was still visible, the last mark that Green Hornet had left in the world. At last it was time. Louis extended his hand, and it was placed the Olympic torch. His legs could no longer reach and push as they once had, but they were still sure beneath him. He raised the torch, bowed, and began running. All he could see in every direction were smiling Japanese faces. There were children peeking out of hooked coats, men who had once worked beside the POW slaves in the steel mills, civilians snapping photographs, clapping, waving, cheering Louis on. And of the 120 Japanese soldiers formed in two columns, they parted to let him pass. Louis ran through the place where cages had once held him, where a black-eyed man had crawled inside him. But the cages were long gone, and so was the bird. There was no trace of them here among the voices, the falling of the snow, and the old and joyful man running. And that's the end of the book. This book is a great book. It's one of the best books I've read, Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. I haven't seen the movie. I've seen the previews for the movie. It doesn't look like it's as good as the book. But one thing I want to clarify is when he's running with us an Olympic torch here, it is crazy. He's running through this village where he was a prisoner of war camp like 40, 50 years earlier. And so he was locked in a cage and starved and beaten. And then now he's running with a torch. The same guy, same person, same country, same neighborhood, same street. Back in the day in the war, the civilians would have killed him, apparently. But now he's running and they're smiling, waving at him, and he's running with a torch. It reminds me of like groups speak, and sometimes the hardest thing in life is to take a stand and to stand out from the group, to be different, to be unique. It's really hard to do. But Louis Zamperini lived a really unique life. This book, it really touched the core with me. It's something that I'm glad I've read in my 30s now. But when I was younger, in my teens and 20s, I really liked the book Into the Wild with Christopher McCandless. And that book left a very strong impression on me. So this book as well, granted, I read it a little bit later, and so it's more important for me in this life. But I really enjoyed it, and it was one of the longest books I've read. It's over 400 pages with the epilogue. Now I really want to see the Watanabe interview. The main thing that I got from this book is just like what they talk about in the very last paragraph, and that's how life can change at any moment. One day he's a prisoner of war and being put in a cage, and then later on in the same neighborhood, he's running with a torch. So things can change. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Now they're gonna start making noises out there because they don't like me reading. But thanks for watching the video. Thanks for supporting my channel. Click the thumbs up button. Send this video to one person, and we're going to keep this growing, and I'm going to keep reading, and you keep reading too. And don't let the people stop you. Thank you. Aloha.